I remember the sound of the envelope tearing. It was a crisp white envelope from the hospital where I had gone for what I thought were simple, routine scans. I expected a normal bill, but as I pulled the paper out, my heart skipped a beat. The MRI charges were 5 times higher than what Medicare usually allows for a scan like that. My hands started to shake as I looked at the total. It wasn't just a high number. It was a small fortune. Tucked inside the bill was a collection notice that felt like a punch to the gut. It warned me of immediate legal action if I didn't pay the thousands of dollars they claimed I owed. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the bolded numbers until they became a blur. I had always been careful with my finances, and I had done everything by the book. This felt like a mistake, or worse, an attack. I whispered to the empty room, "This can't be right, can it?" The silence of the kitchen offered no comfort, only the mounting weight of a debt I knew I hadn't truly earned. Looking at that massive bill, I felt a deep sense of regret. I had always trusted this hospital. In fact, I had spent years praising its care and recommending it to all my friends and family members. I thought they were the good guys, the people who were there to help us when we were at our most vulnerable. Now, staring at the threatening letters, I realized how naive I had been. If only I had questioned them before, I thought to myself, my stomach twisting with the fear of a debt that could ruin my future. I decided I wouldn't just sit there and let them scare me. I picked up my phone and dialed the billing department, ready to demand an explanation. I listened to the repetitive hold music for what felt like an eternity. But despite my persistence, no one ever picked up the line. The silence on the other end of the phone felt intentional, like a wall they had built to keep people from asking too many questions. I hung up, my fear slowly turning into a cold, hard determination to find the truth. I spent the next several nights sitting on my floor, surrounded by old Medicare statements and hospital receipts. As I started to compare my older bills with this new one, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were duplicate administrative fees charged for the same day, and even charges for tests that I knew for a fact had never been performed on me. It wasn't just a math error, it was a pattern of greed. I tried to talk to my friend, Ben, about what I was finding. I showed him the weird codes and the double charges, but he just shook his head. "You're probably overthinking it, Alex," he said, looking worried. "Hospitals make mistakes, but they don't do this on purpose." I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me otherwise. Then, an email popped up on my phone from the collections agency. It stated that legal proceedings against me might start in just 48 hours. The clock was ticking, and it felt like the hospital was trying to bury me before I could find out what they were hiding. The threat of legal action made me realize I needed more than just my own notes. I needed the official records. I called the hospital again and requested a full, itemized bill that listed every single aspirin and every single minute of the MRI scan. The person on the phone was polite but evasive, telling me the request was in process. I waited. 1 week passed, then another, and then a third. Every time I called for an update, I got the same scripted answer. I grew more suspicious with every passing day, wondering why it was so hard for them to print out a list of my own medical care. Finally, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. I tore it open, expecting to find the answers I needed. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized something was very wrong. Large sections of the document were missing, and the page numbers skipped from 4 to 7. It was clear evidence of an intentional omission. They weren't just being slow, they were actively trying to hide the paper trail that proved their exploitation. I decided to look even closer at the pages they did send. By comparing multiple bills from over the last year, I discovered a strange and disturbing pattern. The same unusual billing codes appeared repeatedly, often for the most minor scans. I started doing research online, looking up what those specific codes meant. They were for high-level emergency procedures that I had never received. The scale of the overcharging seemed completely deliberate, like a machine designed to drain money from unsuspecting patients. I reached out to a few other people I knew who had been to the same hospital. When I looked at their statements, my heart nearly stopped. The exact same weird billing codes appeared on their statements too. This wasn't just a mistake on my bill, it was a systemic issue affecting everyone who walked through those hospital doors. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my own bank account anymore. I was uncovering a massive, hidden operation that was stealing from our entire community. The realization was terrifying, but it also gave me the courage to finally confront the people in charge. I didn't bother with the general billing line this time. I looked up the name of the billing manager, Brenda, and called her office directly. When she finally answered, I didn't hold back. I told her about the duplicate fees, the missing pages in my itemized bill, and the strange codes I had found on my friend's statements. Brenda didn't sound surprised or even concerned. Instead, she was dismissive. She claimed it was all just human error, and that the system was complicated. When I pushed her for more details, her tone changed instantly. She became cold and warned me that if I didn't stop my harassment of the hospital staff, I would face serious legal consequences. She hung up on me before I could say another word. I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear, feeling a mix of anger and genuine fear. I considered contacting a lawyer, but I was unsure of what the consequences would be for my reputation and my career. The hospital was a giant institution, and I was just one person. But I couldn't let them keep stealing from us. Feeling alone and overwhelmed, I decided to post a plea for help on a community message board. I described the weird billing codes and the threats I had received from Brenda. To my surprise, I got a message from a man named Walter. He was a retired Medicare auditor who had spent 30 years looking for fraud. We met at a small coffee shop, and he spent hours looking over my documents. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a hidden network of shell companies that the hospital was using to funnel money illegally. He explained that these companies were likely being used to hide the overcharges and make the hospital look like it was barely making a profit. Walter looked me in the eye and gave me a very serious warning. If the executives find out you have this information, they'll try to bury this, fast, he said. He told me that I had stumbled onto something much bigger than a billing error. I was looking at a high-level criminal scheme. Having Walter as an ally made me feel stronger, but his words also made me realize how much danger I was truly in. A few days later, I received a surprising call from the hospital. A new administrator told me that they had decided to agree to review all of my past bills. They sounded very helpful and promised that they wanted to make things right. For a moment, I felt a rush of false hope. I thought that maybe my persistence had finally paid off and that the problem would be fixed without a fight. I waited for their final report, hoping for an apology and a corrected balance. However, when the staff finally called me back, their tone was completely different. They told me they had finished the review and that everything seems correct. They even suggested that I owed them more than they originally thought. As I looked through the new summary they sent, I noticed something even more suspicious. Several of the charges I had previously flagged as fraudulent were now missing from the list entirely. The hospital wasn't cooperating at all. They were trying to scrub the evidence before I could use it against them in court. As I continued to dig, the atmosphere around the hospital became increasingly tense. I had to go back to the records office one more time to try and get the missing pages. While I was there, I noticed the staff acting incredibly nervous. They wouldn't look me in the eye, and they whispered to each other whenever I walked by. I even saw a clerk quickly hiding a stack of documents under a desk as I approached. Every time I tried to follow up on my requests, I was met with silence or calls being abruptly hung up. It felt like the walls were closing in on their secrets. I realized that a key invoice, which Walter said was crucial for proving the fraud, was now missing from my file entirely. They were actively destroying the paper trail. I knew I had to move faster. If I didn't secure the evidence soon, there would be nothing left to prove what they had done. The hospital was no longer just a business. It was a crime scene, and the people in charge were busy cleaning up the evidence. I decided to take a different approach. Since the physical papers were disappearing, I started looking at the digital signatures on my Medicare statements. While auditing my old electronic records, I noticed a repeating offshore billing code that I hadn't seen before. It was a long string of numbers that appeared across dozens of patient bills I had collected from the community. I spent an entire night researching that specific code. My heart pounded in my chest when I finally found a link. The research connected the code to a shell company registered in the Caribbean. This was the proof Walter had been talking about. The hospital was sending money from Medicare directly into an offshore account that had nothing to do with medical care. It was a technology clue that they couldn't just shred or hide in a desk drawer. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I finally had a digital footprint that led straight to the heart of their corruption. I was no longer just a victim of a high bill. I was a detective uncovering a global fraud network. With the offshore code in hand, I knew I needed more people to stand with me. I started going door to door, interviewing other patients and collecting their receipts, statements, and emails. It was heartbreaking to hear their stories. Many of them were elderly people on fixed incomes who had been terrified by the collection notices. Some had even used their life savings to pay the fraudulent bills because they were afraid of going to jail. However, many of them were still too afraid to speak out publicly. They feared that the hospital would refuse to treat them in the future if they made a scene. Just as I was starting to build a solid group, a man in a suit knocked on my door. He handed me a thick envelope from the hospital's legal department. It was a cease and desist letter, threatening me with a massive defamation lawsuit if I didn't stop talking to other patients. They were trying to silence me by threatening to take everything I owned. Instead of scaring me, it only made me more certain that I was winning. Just when I thought the hospital's legal threats might actually work, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line simply said, "Look at this." Inside were attached confidential internal documents from a whistleblower who worked inside the hospital's executive offices. I opened the files and couldn't believe my eyes. They were internal memos showing the hospital executives specifically instructing the billing staff to overcharge Medicare for routine scans. There were even spreadsheets showing how much extra profit they expected to make from the fraud. The documents were the smoking gun I had been looking for. As I read through the names attached to the emails, I realized the fraud went all the way to the top of the organization. The CEO and the board of directors weren't just aware of the overcharging. They were the ones who had come up with the plan. This wasn't a mistake by a few clerks. It was a criminal conspiracy led by the people who were supposed to be the leaders of our community. After the anonymous tip, the hospital's intimidation tactics escalated to a terrifying level. They weren't just sending letters anymore. They filed personal lawsuits against me, claiming I had hacked their systems. I even received a call from my employer, telling me that the hospital's legal team had contacted them to complain about my unethical behavior. They were trying to destroy my life from every angle, even pressuring my friends and neighbors to discourage me from continuing my investigation. Ben told me he couldn't be seen with me anymore because he was afraid for his own job. I felt a deep sense of isolation as the people I cared about started to pull away. But even as the pressure mounted, I refused to back down. I knew that if I stopped now, the hospital would continue to steal from thousands of other people. I made a vow to myself that I would expose the truth, no matter what it cost me personally. I was the only thing standing between them and a complete cover-up, and I wasn't going to move. I knew I couldn't wait for the slow process of a lawsuit to fix this. I needed to go public. I spent 3 days drafting a detailed blog post that included all the evidence I had collected, the offshore codes, the whistleblower memos, and the testimonies from other patients. I planned to post it on every social media platform I could find, hoping it would go viral. But the night before I was set to hit publish, something happened. I woke up to find that my computer had been hacked. Many of my files were partially erased, and my internet connection had been cut. The hospital was actively fighting back using digital warfare. My heart raced as I realized they were watching my every move. They wanted to destroy the evidence before the world could see it. Luckily, I had kept physical copies of everything in a secure location that they didn't know about. I spent the rest of the night on a public computer at the library, rebuilding my post. The battle had moved from the billing office to the digital world, and I was ready to fight. Despite the hack and the threats, I finally hit the publish button. I watched as the numbers started to climb. 10 shares, then 100, then thousands. By the next morning, my story was all over the local news. Social media amplified the evidence, and people from all over the country started sharing their own stories of hospital overcharging. I could almost feel the small hospital board members starting to sweat as the public spotlight turned toward them. It was my first real victory. But the hospital executives didn't go down without a fight. They sent more threatening legal letters, claiming that my post was full of defamation and demanding that I take it down immediately. They even held a press conference where they called me a disgruntled patient who was trying to spread lies. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. The evidence was too clear, and the offshore codes I had shared were already being investigated by independent tech experts. The wall of silence was finally starting to crack open. As the story continued to spread, Walter, the retired auditor, sat me down to explain exactly how the whole scheme worked. He had spent days analyzing the laundered funds. He showed me how the hospital used shell companies to create fake procedures that were then billed to Medicare. The money would travel through several different accounts before ending up in the offshore Caribbean account I had discovered. It was a brilliant and heartless way to turn government funds into private profit. Walter also told me some even better news. Some mid-level staff at the hospital were secretly starting to cooperate with me. They were tired of being forced to lie to patients and were willing to provide more internal documents. But I had to be careful. Walter warned me that in a situation this big, I had to be sure about who could really be trusted. One wrong move could lead me straight into a trap set by the hospital's executives. I felt like I was walking through a minefield, but the path toward justice was finally becoming clear. The public pressure finally became too much for the government to ignore. A few weeks after my post went viral, federal authorities announced that they were officially beginning an inquiry into the hospital's billing practices. It was the moment I had been dreaming of. The hospital tried to maintain its innocence, claiming in public hearings that any errors were purely administrative. But I knew the truth. I was invited to attend a closed-door meeting with the investigators, and as I sat in the hallway, I saw the executives panicking behind the frosted glass. They were arguing and pointing fingers at each other, their polished masks finally slipping. The system they had spent years building was starting to crumble right in front of them. The fear I had felt at my kitchen table was now being felt by the people who had tried to ruin me. I realized that my persistence hadn't just saved my own bank account. It had triggered a chain reaction that was going to change everything. The power was finally shifting away from the bullies. Knowing they were losing the legal battle, the hospital decided to launch a vicious personal attack against me. They leaked false claims to the media, alleging that I was actually a fraud who was trying to profit from the situation. They claimed I had forged the whistleblower documents and that I was trying to extort the hospital for a large settlement. I saw my name and reputation questioned publicly on the nightly news. People who had once supported me began to wonder if the hospital was right. I received hateful messages online, and for a moment, I felt my resolve begin to waver. I wondered if people would actually believe me in the end, or if the hospital's massive PR machine would win. It was the lowest point of my journey. The hospital wasn't just trying to take my money anymore. They were trying to take my dignity. I realized that the only way to win was to double down on the facts and show the world that the truth was even bigger than the lies they were telling. I knew I had to act fast to save my reputation. I decided to launch a clever counterattack using the very data and patient testimonies I had worked so hard to collect. I held my own public meeting in the town square, showing the original, time-stamped documents that disproved the hospital's smear campaign. I brought several other patients with me, and together we showed the world that our stories were identical. The hospital's lies couldn't stand up to the weight of so many voices speaking the same truth. As the public support shifted back to our side, the hospital executives became even more desperate. They attempted one last cover-up, deleting their internal digital records before the federal investigators could seize their servers. They thought they could erase the evidence of their crimes overnight. But they didn't know that the whistleblowers inside the hospital had already made copies of everything. The more they tried to hide, the more they revealed how guilty they truly were. The desperate scramble to delete the past was only making their future even darker. The final blow to the hospital's defense came from an unexpected source. A high-level whistleblower, who had been watching the executives panic, decided to post thousands of internal emails directly online. The emails showed the CEO and the board discussing the Alex problem and explicitly planning the smear campaign against me. Social media exploded as the emails went viral. Within hours, #HospitalFraud was trending nationwide. The evidence was now so overwhelming that even the hospital's own lawyers started to quit. The executives realized they could no longer control the narrative or the facts. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, surrounded by the proof of their greed and corruption. I sat in my living room, watching the news coverage, and felt a profound sense of relief. The battle was far from over, but the lie had finally been defeated. The world knew what they had done, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The giant institution had finally been brought to its knees by the truth. The climax of the investigation was a massive public hearing where I was called to testify. I walked into the room and saw the CEO, Victor, sitting at the front table. He looked arrogant and cold, still refusing to admit any wrongdoing. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I confronted him directly in front of the cameras, asking him how he could sleep at night knowing he was stealing from the sick and the elderly. The tension in the room exploded as Victor began to shout, arrogantly denying everything and promising that I would face severe retaliation for my testimony. The cameras rolled, capturing his every angry word. The audience watched in shock as the head of a major hospital showed his true colors on national television. They wondered if I could really win against a man with that much power. But as I looked at Victor, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. He was just a man who had been caught, and his anger was the only weapon he had left. The truth was on my side, and that was more powerful than any threat. The hearing was a total disaster for the hospital. Following my testimony, the federal investigators released a massive report that linked the entire hospital board to the fraudulent scheme. Every single member had been involved in the decision to overcharge Medicare and funnel the money into the offshore account. Regulators immediately demanded their resignations. In a final petty act of revenge, the hospital tried to block insurance coverage for other patients in our community, escalating the stakes to a dangerous level. They were trying to use the sick as human shields to protect their own careers. This final move backfired spectacularly, as it only made the public even more furious. Even the people who had been on the fence were now calling for the board to be arrested. The hospital was no longer just a failing business. It was a pariah in the community. The board's attempt to hold the town hostage only ensured that their downfall would be total and complete. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The wheels of poetic justice finally began to turn with incredible speed. Massive fines, lawsuits, and forced resignations hit the hospital all at once. The executives' personal finances were put under a microscope, and investigators found that they had been using the stolen Medicare funds to buy luxury homes and private jets. It was a disgusting display of greed that left the entire community in shock. The hospital attempted one last-minute PR spin, hiring a high-priced firm to try and change the story. They tried to frame the board as misguided rather than criminal. I watched the news, wondering if their expensive lies would succeed in saving them from prison. But the evidence was too strong, and the public's anger was too deep. The time for excuses had passed. Every new revelation only confirmed what I had suspected from that very first bill, that this was a deep, systemic rot that could only be fixed by a total overhaul of the system. The giant was finally falling, and the justice we had fought so hard for was finally within reach. The final resolution came when the federal authorities announced an official crackdown on the entire hospital network. Media outlets across the country broadcast the executives' misdeeds, showing the world exactly how they had exploited the Medicare system. The hospital was forced to issue a public apology to me and to every other patient they had overcharged. I stood on the steps of the courthouse as the news broke, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My persistence had truly changed the system. It wasn't just about my one bill anymore. It was about protecting millions of other people from the same greed. The hospital was placed under new management, and a complete audit of every department was ordered. The people who had tried to silence me were now the ones being silenced by the law. I had started this journey as a frightened woman with a high bill, but I was ending it as a survivor who had helped bring about a national reform. As the dust finally settled, I sat on my porch and reflected on everything that had happened over the last year. I thought about that first day in my kitchen and whispered to myself, if only I had ignored the signs, I would have never seen the truth. My courage, vigilance, and persistence had defeated one of the most powerful and corrupt institutions in the state. Thousands of patients were finally being reimbursed for the overcharges, the hospital culture was being completely reformed, and my story was inspiring a new wave of accountability across the country. I had lost friends and my reputation had been attacked, but in the end, it was all worth it to see justice being done. The closing moral of my story is something I will never forget. Never ignore injustice, even when the fear seems much stronger than your own voice. We all have the power to make a difference if we are willing to stand up and demand the truth. I looked out at my neighborhood, knowing that we were all a little safer because one person refused to be a victim.